Juana Maria never imagined her name would be whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. Before becoming a ghost in the desert, she was just a servant of God, a 30-year-old woman whose entire life had been drawn within the walls of a convent, forgotten by time in northern Mexico. Her story is not a tale of heroism, but a descent into hell, where faith and vengeance became one and the same. If this chronicle has somehow found you, I ask you to join our community. We are trying to reach 1,000 souls who believe that even the most silenced voice deserves to be heard. Comment what part of the world you are from, so this current of solidarity can show us we are not alone. Your subscription is a testament that stories like Juana's matter and need to be told. Raised as an orphan by the Sisters of the Order of Descalced Nuns, Juana knew only two families, the church and the impoverished community that lived in the convent's shadow. Her faith was the foundation of her existence, certainty, as vast and imposing as the desert that surrounded her. She saw God's hand in every sunrise, in every child's smile, and in every life she managed to comfort with her prayers and care. Her compassion was her greatest virtue and, as she would come to discover, her greatest vulnerability. For her, the world was a matter of kind acts, and evil was a distant abstraction, something to be fought with prayers and not with her own hands. Her routine was a sacred cycle of masses, caring for the sick and lessons for the children. The small neighboring village was a cluster of mud and dust houses, a place where hope was a resource as scarce as water. There, Juana was more than a nun. She was a healer, a teacher, a mother to the motherless. She knew every family, every sorrow, every dream silenced by misery. Her work went far beyond religious doctrine. She taught children to read, mothers to make remedies with desert herbs, and men to find dignity in a world that offered them only oblivion. The church, with its white walls and solitary cross, was the beating heart of that place, and Juana was the soul that kept it alive, a beacon of serenity amidst the desolation. Among all the souls she touched, none was as precious to her as Mateo's. A 10-year-old boy, with eyes that reflected the wisdom of a hard-lived life and a smile that could disarm the deepest sadness. He was an orphan, just like her, and saw in Juana the mother figure fate had denied him. She protected him with a ferocity that transcended her vows, seeing in him the personification of the innocence she was dedicated to preserving. They spent hours together in the church courtyard, he learning to read the scriptures, she learning from him the meaning of unconditional love, a love that connected her to the divine in a way no prayer ever had. Mateo was her promise of a better future, the living proof that faith could flourish even in the most arid soil. However, the shadow of the local cartel spread like a plague over the region. Led by a man known only as El Carnicero, the group was a force of brutality that ruled through fear. Their stories were dark legends told in whispers, accounts of violence and cruelty that seemed to belong to another world, not to the sanctuary of peace Juana had built. She heard the villagers' fears, the desperate prayers for protection, and responded with the only weapon she knew, faith. She urged them to pray, to trust in divine justice, piously believing that the walls of her faith were impenetrable, that God's light was strong enough to blind any darkness that dared approach her doors. Life in the convent followed its peaceful rhythm, oblivious to the growing tension suffocating the village. The afternoon sun painted the adobe walls with golden hues as Juana supervised the children at play in the courtyard. The sound of their laughter was a sacred melody, a hymn to resilience and innocence. In that microcosm of serenity, it was easy to believe that evil was nothing more than a distant rumor. Juana watched Mateo run, her heart filling with a deep and gratifying peace. This was her purpose, her calling, to cultivate that small garden of hope in the middle of a desert of despair, protecting its fragile flowers from the harshness of the outside world, unaware that the desert was about to invade her sanctuary. The contrast between life inside and outside the convent walls was absolute. Inside, there was order, silence, and a clear purpose. Outside, chaos and uncertainty reigned. The Mexican desert was not just a landscape, it was a silent predator, a constant reminder of life's fragility. Its unforgiving vastness mirrored the abandonment the community felt, forgotten by a distant government and left to the mercy of cruel forces. The convent, with its green garden and water fountain, was an anomaly, a stubborn manifestation of faith against the indifference of nature and the brutality of men, a sanctuary whose time was dangerously running out. In her nightly prayers under the starry desert sky, Juana asked God for strength, not for herself, but for her people. She prayed for the harvest, for the health of the sick, and for the safety of the children. Her faith was a fortress, and she felt invincible within it. She believed her devotion was a shield, that God's love was armor capable of repelling any evil. She could not conceive of a darkness so profound that it could not be dispelled by the light of prayer. This conviction, pure and unshakable, was the foundation of her identity. A foundation that was about to be torn away so violently it would make her question not only God, but the very nature of her soul. The peace was shattered not by thunder, but by the profane roar of engines. A cloud of dust on the horizon grew until it materialized into a caravan of black trucks that invaded the village like a swarm of metal locusts. The doors flew open, and armed men with faces hardened by cruelty jumped to the ground. Their movements efficient and menacing, the air grew heavy, thick with the smell of gasoline and fear. The children's games stopped, doors slammed shut, and a deadly silence fell over the place. From the lead vehicle, a burly man stepped out. His face was a mask of scars and contempt. He didn't need to say his name. The aura of violence that preceded him was unmistakable. It was El Carnicero, and he had come to defile that sanctuary. He wasted no time on speeches. With the arrogance of a king, inspecting his lands, he walked to the center of the square, his men fanning out to drag the young men from their homes. The purpose was clear and brutal: forced recruitment. The screams of mothers echoed, mingling with the harsh orders of the sicarios. The village, which minutes before had been a haven of community, was transformed into a stage of despair. From the church entrance, Juana watched the scene, her heart pounding in a rhythm of panic and helplessness. Father Francisco, at her side, prayed in a low voice, but the words seemed empty, unable to reach the heavens or to stop the hell unfolding before them. The brutality was methodical, impersonal, and devastating. The wave of terror reached the church courtyard. Mateo, who was watering Juana's flowers, shrank behind her. El Carnicero saw him, and a sadistic smile formed on his lips. He approached, the size and brutality of his being contrasting violently with the boy's small figure. He ordered Mateo to join the other boys. But the child, with a courage born of his love for Juana and the innocence of his heart, refused. He said no, a single word that echoed in the tense silence with the weight of a mortal challenge. El Carnicero laughed, a dry, cruel sound. To him, a child's refusal, especially within a holy place, was a direct affront to his absolute authority. What happened next was a blur of horror that was seared into Juana's soul. The amusement in El Carnicero's eyes was replaced by an icy fury. He drew his gun. Time seemed to stand still. Juana tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but her body was paralyzed by shock. The sound of the gunshot was a tear in the fabric of reality, profaning the sacred air of the courtyard. Mateo fell upon the flowers he had been tending, a red stain spreading over the blessed ground. The silence that followed was the sound of Juana's world breaking into pieces. El Carnicero looked at her, a look of triumph, before turning his back and ordering a retreat, leaving devastation behind as his signature. Juana fell to her knees beside Mateo's body, her white habit now stained with dirt and blood. The tears wouldn't come. In their place, a cold, infinite emptiness settled in. She looked up at the cross atop the church, waiting for an answer, a sign, anything, but the sky remained silent, an indifferent spectator to her agony. In that deafening silence of God and the cowardice of men, a dark promise was born. They had murdered a boy, and with him, the woman she had been. If divine justice would not come, she herself would become the instrument of an earthly and implacable justice. If you have ever felt powerlessness turn into a force that compels you to act, you will understand the choice I made. Subscribe so that together we can give a voice to those who, like me, decided they would no longer be victims. Matteo's funeral was a silent event, suffocated by a grief too heavy to be carried by tears. The entire village attended, but their faces were masks of fear, looking more toward the hills than at the small wooden coffin. Juana remained motionless, a statue of pain dressed in black. She did not cry. The tears had dried up, and in their place, a resolution as cold as steel had solidified in her heart. As the earth was thrown over the grave, she wasn't just burying the boy she loved like a son. She was burying Sister Juana Maria. That day, under the unforgiving Mexican sun, she made a silent vow. Justice would not come from the heavens. It would have to be forged in the fire of the hell they had created. That night, in the solitude of her cell in the convent, the transformation began. The light of a single candle flickered on the stone walls as she picked up a pair of gardening shears. The sound of metal cutting through her long black hair was the first act of her new life, each lock falling to the floor like a broken vow. It was a ritual of renunciation, a shedding of her old identity. Then, with somber solemnity, she removed her habit, the garment that had defined her for her entire life. She folded it with reverent care, as if putting away the shroud of a loved one, and hid it at the bottom of an old chest. The woman who looked into the small, cracked mirror was no longer a bride of Christ. Dressed in the simple, worn clothes of a peasant woman, she became anonymous, a shadow ready to blend into the landscape. The practical clothes, the worn boots, and the short hair were her new armor, the antithesis of the habit that had marked her as a symbol of peace. Her face, once serene, was now a canvas of stark determination, her eyes carrying the weight of what she had seen and what she was about to do. She was no longer Sister Juana. She was just a woman with a purpose, a woman who had traded her rosary for a list of names and her prayers for a plan of vengeance. As she left the convent before dawn, she did not look back. The past was a foreign land to which she could never return. The desert, which had once represented isolation and spiritual trial, became her greatest ally. She knew every canyon, every cave, every hidden spring. The terrain that was hostile to outsiders was a map engraved in her memory. For weeks, she lived like a wild animal, watching, learning, waiting. From distant ridges, she mapped the cartel's supply routes, the patrol schedules, the weaknesses in their logistics. Her patience was infinite, forged by years of monastic life. She used the discipline of her old prayer, routines to hone her new craft. Hunting. The men of El Carnicero moved with the arrogance of those who believe themselves invincible, unaware that a fallen angel was watching them from the shadows. Her chapel was now a cave, hidden behind a curtain of rocks, and her hymns were the howls of the wind. There, she prepared her weapons. She possessed no modern firearms, but her intelligence was lethal. She learned to create traps with the desert's resources, snares made of barbed wire, camouflaged, pits on narrow trails, small rock slides prepared at strategic points in the canyons. She used her knowledge of herbs not to heal, but to create simple poisons. Every trap was a dark prayer, every plan a liturgy of retribution. The convent had taught her to save lives. The desert was teaching her to take them with a calculated and merciless efficiency, turning God's creation into her own tool of destruction. The first attack was against a supply truck rumbling alone down a dirt road. Juana felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a visceral fear mixed with a cold adrenaline. She had sabotaged a small section of the road, and the vehicle tipped into a ditch with a screech of metal. 2 sicarios got out, stunned and furious. It was the first time she had faced the enemy up close. With her face covered by a cloth, she emerged from the rocks. The fight was clumsy, desperate, and brutal. It was not a choreographed battle, but an explosion of raw violence. When it was over, the 2 men lay, motionless in the dust, and the silence of the desert seemed to Juana more deafening than ever. The weight of her actions hit her with the force of a physical blow. She stumbled away and vomited, her body shaking uncontrollably. The image of the lifeless eyes of the man she had killed with her own hands burned in her mind. Was this the path? To become a monster, to hunt another? Doubt gnawed at her. But then she looked at the truck's cargo. Boxes of medicine and food stolen from humanitarian aid. Posts destined for villages like hers. The sight rekindled the flame of her fury. This was not just about revenge for Mateo. It was about justice for all the innocents who suffered. She took the rosary she always carried and left it on the chest of one of the men. It was her signature. The news spread slowly. 2 cartel men dead. An accident, they said at first, but the wooden rosary on the body was intriguing. Was it a warning? An insult? El Carnicero dismissed the incident as the work of an insignificant rival. In the village, however, the story was told in whispers. Someone was fighting back. A spark of hope, small and fragile, began to glow in the darkness of fear. For them, it didn't matter who it was. What mattered was that the cartel's impunity had been challenged. That small act of violence became an instant myth, the first verse of a dark lullaby about an avenging angel who haunted the desert. Her second attack was an ambush on a 4-man patrol in a narrow canyon. This time, there was no hesitation. Her movements were precise, cold, calculated. She used the terrain to create a bottleneck, forcing them to a point where a rock slide she had prepared disoriented them. She eliminated them one by one from the shadows, a lethal apparition. As she watched the last man fall, she didn't feel the nausea of the first time, but a chilling calm, a dark sense of purpose fulfilled. In that moment, she did not ask God for forgiveness. She accepted the darkness that was consuming her. If you understand that sometimes you must become a ghost to haunt your own demons, then continue this journey with us. Your subscription helps tell the stories of those who fight in the shadows. The legend of La Monja Fantasma was born, the ghost nun who left rosaries as a calling card. The news of the attacks sowed fear among the sicarios, superstitious men who feared the supernatural more than bullets. As the cartel grew more paranoid, hope in the village grew. It was then that Isabella, a young woman whose family Juana had helped countless times, made a dangerous decision. She recognized the method, the courage, the righteous fury behind the attacks. With her heart in her throat, she used an old pilgrim's path to find Juana's hideout in the desert. She didn't confront her as a murderer, but as the only hope they had left, offering to be her eyes and ears inside the occupied village. Juana initially refused. Involving Isabella was to put a target on her back, to risk another innocent life. But the young woman was adamant. "You taught us to have faith, sister," she said. "Now you are our faith." Her words shook Juana. She realized her solitary war needed more than just fury. It needed intelligence, information. Reluctantly, she accepted. A dangerous alliance was sealed, built on mutual trust and shared desperation. Isabella became an unlikely spy, her harmless appearance allowing her to overhear conversations and observe movements without raising suspicion, relaying vital information to the desert warrior. Isabella's first piece of information was crucial. She overheard talk of a secret meeting between 2 of El Carnicero's most brutal lieutenants, responsible for extortion in the region. They were to meet in an abandoned cantina to divide the profits. With this information, Juana could plan a surgical strike. It was no longer a random ambush. It was a strategic blow to the heart of the cartel's operations. She prepared the ground meticulously, turning the cantina into a death trap. The war was evolving. Juana was shifting from a mere avenger to a strategist, dismantling the criminal organization piece by piece from the inside out. El Carnicero was not a man who tolerated challenges. The loss of his lieutenants and the money infuriated him. The story of the ghost nun was no longer an annoying rumor. It was a direct threat to his power. The humiliation of being hunted by a legend, a spectre, consumed him. He became obsessed with unmasking and destroying this force that dared to defy him in his own territory. The bounty on the ghost's head was tripled. Heavier and more violent patrols swept the region, and paranoia settled into his ranks. The hunt became personal, a battle of wills between the sadistic crime lord and the woman he himself had created. On one of her rare and risky visits to the village for supplies, Juana was surprised by Father Francisco in the church sacristy. He had been waiting for her. The old priest looked at her, and his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He did not see the nun he had raised, but a hardened stranger with death hanging over her shoulders like a cloak. The smell of gunpowder and desert had replaced that of incense and candles. "What have you become, my child?" he asked, his voice thick with pain. The confrontation Juana had dreaded had arrived. The mirror of her former conscience was before her, and its reflection was that of a killer. The priest's sermon was a torrent of pleas and accusations. He spoke of the soul, of eternal damnation, of God's forgiveness. He begged her to stop, not to lose her soul to hatred. "Vengeance is the Lord's, Juana. You cannot fight darkness by becoming a part of it," he exclaimed, his hands trembling. He represented everything she had abandoned: faith in patience, belief in redemption, the hope that good would prevail without the aid of violence. Every word he spoke was a blow to her already wounded soul, reopening the wounds of her spiritual crisis. Juana's reply was a cold whisper, laden with the fury of all the graves El Carnicero had dug. "Where was your God when they killed Mateo on the sacred ground of this church, Father? Your God was silent." "I heard it," she said, her voice cutting. "My actions are not for heaven, they are for the earth. They are the only prayer these men understand." She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Pray for my soul if you wish, Father, but pray also that I finish what I've started. To those who are listening, know that your support is proof that even the darkest journeys deserve to be understood. Your subscription is a sign that I am not alone." Despite her hardened facade, the priest's words haunted her. The nights in the desert grew longer, populated by nightmares. She saw Mateo's face, not smiling, but with eyes full of accusing sadness. She saw the men she had killed, their faces frozen in the moment of death. She would wake up with her own scream caught in her throat, her body drenched in cold sweat. The loneliness of her war was overwhelming. She was trapped between the monster she was becoming and the woman she could no longer be. With every life she took to protect the innocent, she felt a piece of her own humanity die. There was a moment she almost gave up, trapped in a cave by a violent sandstorm that lasted 2 days. Doubt consumed her. The voices in her head, Mateo's, the priest's, her victims, became a deafening chorus. Maybe the priest was right. Maybe she was just perpetuating the cycle of violence, her soul irretrievably lost. She held the revolver she had taken from one of her targets, the cold barrel against her temple, wondering if peace could only be found in the silence of death. The weight of her sins was a mountain that threatened to crush her completely. But then, as the storm subsided and the first light of dawn entered the cave, she saw something that made her pause. In a crevice in the rock, a small, stubborn desert flower had bloomed, its vibrant color an act of defiance against the surrounding aridity. It was fragile, but alive. It reminded her of Mateo's garden, of the innocence and life she had sworn to protect. This wasn't about her soul, nor about revenge. It was about ensuring that other flowers like it had a chance to bloom. With renewed determination, she stood up. The war was not over. She no longer fought for her salvation, but for the survival of a future that Matteo represented, her. Attacks became more daring and sophisticated. She no longer focused only on eliminating sicarios, but on destabilizing the entire operation. She began to use psychological warfare, leaving coded messages with religious symbols at the scenes of her attacks, spreading rumors of betrayal among the cartel's men. She burned drug fields, destroyed hidden labs, and intercepted payments. La Monja Fantasma was no longer just a killer. She was an insurgent force, a one-woman army that was bleeding El Carnicero's empire, inspiring fear not just through violence, but through the intelligence and unpredictability of her actions. The pressure was getting to El Carnicero. His empire, once unshakable, was showing cracks. The legend of the nun was driving him mad. He saw betrayal in every shadow, insubordination in every glance. His cruelty, once a tool of control, became erratic and self-destructive. In a fit of paranoia, he publicly executed one of his most loyal men, accusing him of collaborating with the ghost. This act fractured the loyalty of his inner circle. The fear he inspired was slowly turning into resentment. Juana wasn't just killing his men, she was poisoning the roots of his power. On a mission to sabotage a communication line, Juana fell into a trap. An unexpected patrol cornered her. She narrowly escaped, but not before taking a grazing bullet to her leg. The pain and blood loss reminded her of her mortality. She was not a spirit, she was flesh and blood. Wounded, she dragged herself for miles to her hideout, the physical pain an echo of her spiritual torment. The experience shook her deeply, forcing her to be even more careful, even more lethal. She knew her luck wouldn't last forever. Time was running out. Isabella, noticing El Carnicero's increased brutality in the village in response to the attacks, risked everything. She got close to one of the younger, disaffected sicarios, using her cunning to extract a vital piece of information. El Carnicero had a weakness, a secret from his past that, if revealed, would destroy his reputation as an untouchable man and could turn his own men against him. The information was a time bomb, but delivering it to Juana, with the village under constant surveillance, seemed like a suicide mission. The danger for both of them had reached a critical level. Using a system of signals with mirrors that Juana had taught the children for games years before, Isabella managed to transmit a coded message. Juana, from her observation post in the mountains, understood. The information was the key to victory, but she also sensed a trap. El Carnicero was getting smarter, more desperate. He was using the village as bait, knowing the ghost had ties to the community. Juana realized the next move had to be decisive, as any mistake would cost not only her life, but Isabella's and everyone else's. El Carnicero's suspicion finally found a focus. His brutal torture of a captured villager revealed the existence of an informant, someone from within. Although the man didn't know the identity, he mentioned the people's loyalty to the former nun from the church. For the first time, El Carnicero's attention turned to the convent, to the forgotten figure of Juana Maria. The pieces began to fit together in his paranoid mind, the religious symbolism, the fury that seemed personal. He wasn't sure yet, but a target was forming. The hunt for the ghost was finally getting close to home. Juana knew the game had changed. The guerrilla war in the shadows was no longer sustainable. El Carnicero was too close to discovering her identity and would use the entire village as a hostage to lure her out. The only way to end it was to force a direct confrontation, a checkmate. She could no longer hide in the desert. She had to strike at the heart of her enemy's power, decisively and finally. The legend of La Monja Fantasma needed one last chapter, one that would be written not in the desert sands, but in the halls of the place she once called home. The fury of El Carnicero, upon confirming the identity of his tormentor, was apocalyptic. He no longer wanted to just kill the ghost. He wanted to annihilate the symbol, erase the legend, crush the woman behind it. With calculated brutality, he led a direct assault on the convent. The sacred doors were breached, and the sanctuary of peace was invaded by men who knew not the meaning of the word. The nuns, the sisters who raised Juana, were dragged from their prayers and taken hostage. El Carnicero turned the house of God into his headquarters, desecrating the altar with his weapons and tequila bottles. He sent his message to the village, the life of every nun for the head of Juana Maria. The holy place became the bait in a diabolical trap. The news reached Juana like a lightning bolt through a desperate signal from Isabella. Juana's world contracted to a single point of pain and responsibility. Her personal war had put the only people who still loved her in the line of fire. Guilt was a poison in her veins, but there was no time for regret. The decision was instantaneous, devoid of any doubt. She had to go back. She had to walk into the lion's den, not to save her soul, but to rescue the last vestiges of her past life. Her journey back across the desert was a dark pilgrimage, each step bringing her closer to her final damnation or redemption. She was no longer a fugitive. She was an approaching storm. Under the cover of night, she reached the outskirts of the convent. The sight was a blasphemy. Powerful floodlights swept across the adobe walls, replacing the serene moonlight. Armed guards patrolled the rooftops where she used to watch the stars. The sound of vulgar music and harsh laughter leaked from the chapel windows, a sacrilege that wounded her ears. This was no longer her home. It was an enemy fortress, a perverted version of her dearest memories. A cold, precise rage took hold of her, clearing her mind of all fear and hesitation. She was not there to negotiate or to pray. She was there to cleanse that place with fire and blood, to perform an exorcism with bullets. The convent had secrets, and Juana knew all of them. An old service passage, used to carry supplies from the cellar to the kitchen and long forgotten, became her point of entry. She moved through the dark corridors like a spectre, each step silent on a floor she knew like the back of her hand. The air was thick with the smell of cigarettes and sweat, a violation of the scent of beeswax and incense from her memories. The shadows danced, and in every statue of a saint, in every crucifix on the wall, she saw silent witnesses to her unholy mission. She was a ghost in her own home, hunting the demons that had invaded it and preparing to drag them to hell. The purge began from the inside out. She used the element of surprise with brutal efficiency. The first guard fell in the silence of the library, the second in the darkness of the confessional. She moved with the certainty of one who knows the terrain and the fury of one who defends the sacred. Panic began to spread among the sicarios. They were hunters in an open desert, not rats trapped in a dark labyrinth with a predator who knew every turn. Gunshots echoed erratically through the stone corridors, and the screams of their men became increasingly sporadic. El Carnicero, on his makeshift throne at the altar, realized too late that his fortress had become his tomb. The final confrontation took place in the main chapel. Juana entered, a shadowy apparition against the light of the stained glass windows. El Carnicero was waiting for her, using the terrified nuns as a human shield in front of the altar. "Juana Maria," he snarled, savoring the name. "God's little lamb finally shows her fangs." He taunted her, mocking her faith, Mateo, her transformation. But Juana was unshaken. In a cold voice, she exposed his secrets, the truths Isabella had given her, revealing him as a coward and a traitor in front of his last men. The battle that followed was a fury of violence, a savage duel between broken faith and absolute brutality in the desecrated heart of her world. In his final act of cowardice, El Carnicero grabbed the Mother Superior, putting the gun to her head. "Shoot, nun!" he screamed, his face twisted in a triumphant grimace. "Show your God how far you've fallen." He believed the remnant of her vows would stop her. For an instant, time. He froze. Juana saw the woman who raised her, the monster who destroyed her life, and the path of no return she had walked. In that moment she knew that to save the sacred she would have to commit the ultimate sacrilege. Her shot was true, a feat of impossible precision that tore through the butcher's shoulder, making him release his hostage before a second shot silenced him forever. I thank every one of you who has subscribed, for you prove that a fight like this deserves to be remembered. When the last echo of the gunshot faded, a heavy, sacred silence fell upon the chapel. It was over. The nuns, freed from captivity, looked at Juana not as the sister they knew, but as an otherworldly apparition, an angel of death whose presence was as terrifying as that of the men she had destroyed. The relief on their faces was mixed with a primal fear. The church floor was stained with blood, and the holy icons lay broken, silent witnesses to a victory that felt like a defeat. Juana looked at the destruction, at the lives she had saved and the ones she had taken, and felt a profound emptiness. Justice had the bitter taste of ash and gunpowder. There was no celebration, only the silent mourning for what was lost. Father Francisco arrived with the first rays of dawn, finding a scene of slaughter in his house of God. He looked at the bodies, at the devastation, and finally at Juana, who stood like a solitary sentinel amidst the carnage. In the old priest's eyes, she saw no condemnation, no anger, only an infinite sadness, the grief of a shepherd for his most lost sheep. They exchanged no words. None were necessary. They both knew there was no place for her there anymore. She had cleansed the temple by becoming unclean. To save her home, she had lost it forever. The chasm that separated her from her past was uncrossable, and the silence between her and the priest was their final farewell. Before the village fully awoke, she prepared to leave. She met with Isabella one last time, not in the shadows, but in the faint light of dawn. She handed the young woman a bag with all the cartel money she had recovered. "Rebuild," Juana said, her voice hoarse. "Take care of them. Give them hope, not legends about ghosts." It was the transfer of a burden, the passing of a torch. Juana took nothing for herself but the weapon she carried and the ghosts that would accompany her forever. She walked away without saying goodbye to anyone else, a solitary figure moving toward the desert. Her final act was not of violence, but of renunciation, erasing herself from the history of that place so it could have a future. As the sun rose over Mexico, Juana Maria walked toward the horizon, growing smaller and smaller against the vastness of the desert. She did not look back. The convent, the village, the life that was once hers, it was all behind her. She was no longer a nun, nor a named vigilante. She was an anonymous legend, a whispered tale to frighten tyrants and inspire the oppressed. Her destiny was not peace, but a perpetual solitary war against injustice, wherever she might find it. Forever haunted by her choices, she found her only penance in continuing the fight, a wandering soul in search of an absolution she knew she would never reach. My story, like the woman I once was, ends here, at the edge of that dusty village. But the fight I embraced has no end. It continues in every act of courage against oppression, in every voice that refuses to be silenced. I sacrificed myself, traded my soul for the safety of others, and I do not ask for forgiveness, only that my journey was not in vain. If the echo of my actions has touched you, honor my memory, not just by subscribing so that other stories like mine may be told, but by carrying the spark of justice into your own world. May my silent voice, somehow, inspire yours to rise.